Thank you, Mayor. And I remember us bringing this forward, Pierluigi and yourself and myself putting forward a memo on thinking of different ways to think out of the box. And at Jackie's suggestion, that we decided to go with this program and we started in my district with Holy Spirit Church, in fact. And I can remember a time where I was having to fight some of the negative objections from the neighborhood, some of the parishioners, and Father Brennan and I had, did a lot together to calm people's fears. And now this pilot program was so successful that we're proud of it, and it rotates throughout the churches in my district, and we're really happy with the outcome, and the people who attend worship in these places have done more than just open their doors. They've opened their wallets and they've opened their hearts to these people, and they let them in and help them. They've taken a personal approach to helping people in need, and this is something that I don't think government can actually necessarily give to people. Is the hope that these the interfaith places of worship that have done for them can. We've done dozens of homeless women, and these places of worship, like I said, provide a home for the homeless, and they've renewed hope in the hopeless. Now, I'm super supportive of the mayor, my council colleagues, both their memos. In fact, I do not understand some of the differences in them. I think one of the things that's being proposed is a non-religious. If I read your memo right, it's something about allowing non-religious places to be part of it, and I don't understand how that would work. I mean, I don't understand how that would work. So I don't know who. Is it you who recommended it, or staff recommending it, or?
Yeah. Well, it was my office that put forward the memo, but I think we had been talking to folks. I'm not sure if they were some of the advocates or if it was the housing department.
Thank you, council members. The proposed ordinance is for places of assembly, and we were advised very early on by the attorney's office and concurred from a practical point of view to not limit the ordinance to religious places of assembly, but rather any place of assembly. So that could apply to a gymnasium that's part of a school, for example, or a community center. And there might be some nonprofit organizations that can take advantage of our ordinance for a place of assembly that's not tied to a religious use.
And the organization, if it is in a non-religious use, they would need to go through the same process, right? I mean, everything, yeah, okay.
Correct.
So my question then is, in these places of worship, there's like 24/7 people helping folks and whatnot. I remember when we did this ordinance, we opened up our libraries and gyms and community centers, but those were for emergency purposes, and I'm not sure that we weren't necessarily providing job placement, and some of the other stuff that we're talking about in these this other program. So I kind of put them in two separate boxes. But what you're saying now is we want to do that there too.
If I can just chime in from the legal side, and then Jenny, you can go from the policy side. The issue from a legal standpoint is anytime this is a land use provision, we can't enact a land use provision that either burdens or shows a preference towards a religious use, as opposed to any assembly use. So everything is seen as sort of neutral in terms of it's an assembly use. As a practical matter, 95% of the assembly uses are religious organizations, churches, but we drafted in a way that's neutral with respect to religion. My intent, my thinking is not that way. I'm just thinking like a place of assembly can be a park, right?
So somebody can create a encampment basically at a park, and that's not something we're talking about.
No,
right?
that's not what we're talking about, and that's not the assembly use under the zoning code. So, Jenny, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, the place of assembly has to be in an assembly building. So, maybe there's landscape as part of the site, but there have to be buildings, and it has to be shelter in a building. And that's why the limit is, for incidental shelter, is 50 people or as determined by the fire department, whichever is the more restrictive. And so what we're thinking is that, as I mentioned before, there might be some, not just city, but other types of community centers or schools that might want to provide either incidental or now we're proposing temporary shelter. And they're not necessarily tied to a religious use. And those would also have the opportunity to provide that.
And I appreciate that. And like I said, this program has been, for me, it's been great. I actually went and cooked for some of the housed at one of the churches, and I think this program really hit the mark. And I'm very supportive of making it permanent, quite frankly. And are you saying that you can't make it permanent at this time, or could we just use Councilmember Jimenez's memo to basically make it permanent?
Right now we have, because it was passed on an urgency basis, we have what's called an interim ordinance, and it's expiring at the end of June. We can't extend it, and that is for temporary shelter. Based initially on the feedback we got from the stakeholders, there was an interest in going beyond the level of shelter and the extent of it that was provided under the temporary shelter provisions. So we crafted an ordinance, a permanent, regular ordinance, for incidental shelter that could be provided 365 days a year, and the only limitation is no more than 50% of the usable space in the places of assembly, the buildings. And that seemed to meet the interest of the people that we were engaged with at community meetings. And then only a couple of days ago, we heard from some other providers that the temporary shelter provisions in the ordinance that's set to expire at the end of June is also of interest to some churches that are in residential neighborhoods and don't need to provide the shelter at each location 365 days a year, but do need to have no minimum setback from residential uses. So we're proposing to take the temporary shelter provisions in the interim ordinance and carry them through to the permanent ordinance along with incidental shelter. So there'll be two types of shelter uses, incidental and temporary.
Okay, perfect. Then I am understanding this well. Good. All right. So I guess I'll wait for one of my colleagues to make a motion on their own memos, and I thank you and staff for all your work, and I especially thank our church leaders for opening up their doors and their hearts to these folks and doing the work that you do in our community. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for supporting this program.